Johanan Raatz is probably the most prominent proponent of theistic idealism on YouTube. He believes that the soul must exist because it is simply impossible, even nonsensical, for the mind to simply be a program carried out by the brain. In support of this view, he often cites the Chinese room thought experiment. This experiment asks you to imagine a guy in a room in which he is receiving messages in Chinese. He doesn't speak Chinese, but he has an instruction manual that tells him how to do the calculations that an artificially intelligent computer program would do if that program did understand Chinese. And this gives him the ability to formulate responses that are indistinguishable from the ones one would expect from a person with a genuine understanding. John Searle, the guy who came up with the thought experiment, doesn't believe that the program the guy is carrying out can have any real conscious understanding of the messages or the responses it formulates, despite the fact that it is able to seem as though it understands. How can it be that a room with a guy who speaks no Chinese, shuffling papers around, doing calculations, can have any real conscious understanding of these messages? How can the program he is carrying out have such an understanding? The problem with this thought experiment is that it assumes, baselessly I think, that witnessing the operation of a conscious process should be comparable to the experience had by a brain or computer program which is undergoing that process. For example, it seems to assume that if the program is mentally picturing the color purple, then we should see the color purple somewhere in there when we see the program doing this. I think this is a very silly non sequitur. Raatz seems to think that since it's the case that when you look at the program running, you don't see its subjective experiences, this proves it's not really having subjective experiences. It's been pointed out to him that this is a masked man fallacy. Martimer81 gives a good example of a masked man fallacy.
Lois Lane believes that Superman can fly. She does not believe that Clark Kent can fly. Therefore, Superman and Clark Kent are not the same person. Except that what Lois believes about Superman is not a property of Superman, but of Lois. That's the masked man fallacy.
Raatz is making the same mistake in reasoning. The fact that the experience of witnessing neurological processes is different from the experience of undergoing those processes does not mean that neurological processes can't be conscious. Raatz responds that the masked man fallacy can't apply to consciousness because masked consciousness is a contradiction in terms. He believes that if you can't be conscious of a program's consciousness from a third-person perspective, then those processes can't be conscious. In other words, if the consciousness is masked, it must not really be there. But if this is true of programs, why isn't it true of people, or even of God? You can't see the subjective experiences that other people are having from observing their behavior or their brains. By Ratz's logic, this means that they must not be having subjective experiences. Raatz may respond that the brain is not really conscious, but the person is. But since we can't directly perceive the subjective conscious experiences other people are having, doesn't that mean that their subjective conscious experiences are masked to us? And if consciousness can't be masked, wouldn't that mean that they can't really be conscious? The problem with the Berkeleyan variety of idealism to which Raatz subscribes is that it inescapably implies solipsism. In fact, it implies atheistic solipsism. Raatz and Berkeley believe that the idea of matter existing independent of the concept of matter is incoherent, because anytime you think of matter, you're thinking of the concept. You can't think of non-conceptual matter because you can't think of anything non-conceptual. Berkeley says that besides spirits, all that we know or conceive are our own ideas. Bertrand Russell quite astutely points out that he ought not, of course, to make an exception for spirits, since it is just as impossible to know spirit as to know matter. Berkeley's argument, if it is correct, is as problematic for theism as it is for materialism. If it is incoherent to speak of matter as having any existence independent of one's thoughts of matter, then it is also incoherent to speak of God having any existence independent of one's thoughts of God. If Berkeley's arguments about the ontology of non-concepts is true, all other minds, including God, cannot be anything more than concepts.